Glasgow River Festival celebrates the River Clyde's past, present and future. A common expression is that Glasgow made the Clyde and the Clyde made Glasgow, with the river playing a central role in Glasgow's current regeneration. This saying is as appropriate as ever. The riverside is changing into a place for leisure activities, services and luxury accommodation, reflecting the city's credentials as Glasgow, Scotland with style. From being a major centre of production to one of consumption, the river is a key player in the city's turnaround.
Up until the middle of the 20th century, the Clyde was really the focus of industry and activity for the city. So it wasn't a beautiful river that people would like to live beside.
The riverside was oily, it was black. There was nothing growing. Of course, then the river was very busy. There was paddle steamers coming up, there was huge boats getting towed up and down. But these days, long gone. And maybe as well. I mean, you can look at it through rose-tinted glasses and say, they were great days. They weren't great days. Looking back now, they were horrible days. What people had to put up with.
You've got a river which functioned as an industrial focus for the city's activity, and then that activity ceases and dies away, and shipbuilding stops, and river transport ceases, and the river silts up. And it almost becomes a sort of backwater in the heart of the city.
And if your employment opportunities decline, if your industries decline, there's a tendency for your population to decline as it moves out from the city. If it emigrates out of Scotland, which is one of the worries, if it moves outside of Glasgow to other towns or new towns.
Glasgow was the most seriously declining cities in the 70s and 80s in Britain. The population halved from 1.2 million to over 500,000, and this was due to several reasons.
Very low birth rate, a high death rate, which has been part of the reason for population decline, as well as out-migration. It's the biggest decline, the biggest shrinking city of any place in Europe.
Part of that was, rightly or wrongly, a conscious policy, because some of the housing conditions in the immediate post-war years were not good, and there was an overspill programme put in place that moved people out of Glasgow to the new towns. But also most local authorities in Scotland actually had arrangements to move people from Glasgow to new council accommodation in their areas.
Leaving behind in Glasgow the least qualified and socially disadvantaged people. And that caused problems in particular communities, especially close to the river and in the East End of Glasgow.
Government policy was not very sympathetic to Glasgow for a long time, particularly under Conservatives. The Scottish Office, they planned for the decline of Glasgow. The talk was of managed decline. They thought that as an industrial city it didn't have a long-term future. So it's not surprising if that reinforced the decline of the city. It wasn't the main explanation for the decline. The main explanation was deindustrialization.
There was population decline, it was shrinking in terms of its economy, and it was shrinking physically. If you describe the city as the administrative city, the boundaries were shrinking. The last change in the boundaries, I think, were in the mid-90s, where Glasgow again lost parts of its boundary. So the city became quite tightly bounded.
If you define the city by the built-up area, the functional city, including the suburbs, it is still a shrinking city, in fact. And that's partly because there are parts of Glasgow in Lanarkshire, Motherwell, Airdrie, Coatbridge, Hamilton, that are still shrinking. There are also parts in the west, Clydebank, Inverclyde, Port Glasgow, Greenock. So taken as a metropolitan area, the population is still declining. But the core city, the administrative city, Glasgow City Council area, has stabilised.
The economic strategy, I think, for a while was determined almost purely by getting jobs. To reverse the decline was the main target. For a period in the 70s and 80s when the decline was really at its peak, The strategy was quite opportunistic. It was almost anything that would stop the decline we would try and grab hold of, not quite any kind of job, but we weren't too choosy. It was a focus on services, quite a strong effort on building up the city centre.
It was really local agencies that said, we must stop this decline. And they became much more positive about Glasgow's future. And that dates back really to the early 1980s. Michael Kelly became the provost of the city. And he launched a slogan called Glasgow's Miles Better. And everybody thought that was a joke, because Glasgow was still declining. And what miles better than what? But anyway, it was a sort of start of a new positive campaign to try and promote Glasgow and to restore confidence on the part of local people as well as outsiders.
10 years ago was a turning point in Glasgow. Almost all of the statistics began to turn upwards in economic terms in the mid-90s. A lot of people then said this was a blip, but it's been going on in a sustained pattern for 10 years. So we've now got to the point where we're generating jobs consistently. The quality of those jobs is increasing. And I think what you're beginning to see now is a renewal of the kind of depth and diversity of the economy. There are new industries, older industries are stabilising. What manufacturing is left tends to be quite high quality. And as the city economy has improved, and as the type and nature of the economy has shifted to what we almost entirely service-based economy now, manufacturing's about 8% of the Glasgow economy. Jobs have come back to Glasgow. We've been one of the fastest growing jobs generators in Britain in the last decade.
So that's a big achievement, to have turned around a city from decline in the economy to growth again.
The growth of the city that has made one of the biggest impacts, apart from the high technology based activities, has been the growth of tourism and retailing. Glasgow is now the most important retail centre. It has the largest floor space and turnover outside London.
Glasgow has had quite a lot of increased public spending in health, in education, in public administration. So those have really been the two key drivers of the regeneration of Glasgow: public sector and consumer services.
The Science Centre and the Media Park are very important in terms of they are major signals of the industrial regeneration of the area, and the industrial regeneration based on media and new high-tech industries. And that's good. These are very, very important services.
The third biggest part of the recovery has been the growth in certain services, particularly call centres and shared services, back office functions. But call centres, Glasgow is, some people say, the call centre capital of Britain now.
The cultural expansion of Glasgow has been absolutely astonishing, with the European City of Culture. A new concert hall was built. We now have opera, ballet, symphony concerts. The BBC is located here, so is commercial television. So it really is the cultural hub of Scotland, particularly in the performance area.
Glasgow's always been a fairly cultured city and had a strong cultural base that was built up alongside the success and wealth of the industries. But as they started to decline, pressure comes on things like cultural activities, which many people regard as sort of fairly frivolous activity, and the result is you start sort of cutting back. I discovered that if you spent £100,000 on cultural activities, the national media would give you coverage equivalent to about £500,000 saying how wonderful you were and what wonderful things you were doing. Our success in tourism sort of developed from that, because if you make your city more attractive to its citizens and you do things that improve their quality of life, other people want to come and see that. They want to come and enjoy the activities that they've read about perhaps in the national media.
Glasgow was very good at that. In fact, it was a pioneer of cultural industries, the creative city, those kinds of ideas. They weren't very well articulated at the time, and academics, including myself, were a bit sceptical. But actually it has proved to be a successful strategy in terms of many other cities have copied it.
Today there are questions of sustainability of this consumer-based recovery. Consumer spending and public spending cannot continue at the same rate, so the growth of the city can be questioned.
The growth has not been evenly shared, and in fact a lot of the benefits of Glasgow's recovery are shared by communities which are actually outside the city. The suburban commuter settlements, particularly to the north of the city, but which work in Glasgow but contribute very little to the tax base of the city.
There's also been concentrated efforts by particularly the local authority to bring back population by increasing the level of households. Some of that involves wider strategies like education and whatever. There's a pattern in Glasgow that if people get to the point where they have children, both for school reasons and for the fact that the suburbs are outside of the boundaries, they move out of the city. So there's an attempt to provide better schools, better housing, so that doesn't need to happen.
We know that we've been lacking accommodation, housing for people who wish to buy into more upmarket property. It's been a weakness of Glasgow in terms of property tax bands. And Glasgow's always been well represented at the cheaper bands, which reflect cheaper property, and compared to other Scottish cities has been very underrepresented at the top of that tax band pyramid. So it's been a key thrust of the council to try and redress that, to broaden the range of housing opportunities there are in the more upmarket, the more expensive properties.
People do like living on and beside water. There is something magical. I'm convinced that it's not about water itself. It's about light, and it's about the patterns of light on the water. It's actually the play of the light, which is just fantastic. And people, all over Europe live beside canals, beside rivers, and beside the sea because of the particular delight that, that creates. And the fact is that Glasgow has all this unused industrial hinterland sitting right on the river, and this huge asset which has really, until relatively recently, not been fully appreciated. And now we do have the plan to regenerate the whole length of the river. Glasgow Harbour is, I feel, a little overscaled, and I think it has potential problems because it doesn't really work at a community level. You want to work at 6 or 7 stories, and that's a good size for a city, because essentially that allows for communication between the ground and the top level. But Glasgow Harbour, obviously stands there as a sort of powerful symbol of major regeneration. That was derelict industrial hinterland, albeit, the former granaries might have looked magnificent. They no longer had any function. So they've gone, and we have new housing, and that has to be positive.
The population of Glasgow has stabilized. It's mainly due to in-migration, but it's not a permanent migration. However, it is still significant for the city.
The city's also had a policy of encouraging and working with the UK government to bring asylum seekers to Glasgow as part of the UK government's programme. And there are also a significant number of people come from the A8 accession states, the new members of the European Union, to Glasgow to gain employment. Some we hope will stay here, others may stay for a while and then return to their own countries. But they've had a significant impact on population levels within Glasgow.
Because of the asylum status, people actually can't work until they actually are allowed to pass the rigorous scenarios that they have to go through when they come for asylum.
When an asylum seeker is given permission to stay, they lose the housing that has been provided, and they have to leave it. In addition, because they have been effectively deported from the place where they began, in probably the London area, there will be a strong reason for them to return. And consequently, the asylum seeker population continually turns over. As far as the workers who come here from Poland and Central and Eastern European countries to work, again, they have families and they have relations in their home countries. And although some may stay, it's highly likely that most will want to go back, and many do go back.
The expansion of higher education has been very substantial, with a new university founded and a huge expansion in student numbers.
It provides a sort of a steady stream of temporary migrants to the city. In fact, many students also work in call centres, in hotels, in restaurants and so on. They're another source of revitalisation of the city.
The other ingredient of migration, natural change, i.e. births and deaths, has changed in a positive way too. So if we start to look at our projections over the next 10 years, then we can see the population naturally regenerating itself as more births than deaths are expected.
There are big social challenges of places and people that are excluded from this new prosperity. Over half of the neighbourhoods in Glasgow are part of the 15% most deprived neighbourhoods in Britain.
A lot of the people from these problem areas are either unemployed, which is almost a profession in itself, living on benefits, or they work in the lowest paid jobs in the service sector, which have the most difficult working conditions, so that the revival of these communities is very difficult when their economic base is so limited.
If you pressed me very hard, I think I would be optimistic for the future, but that is dependent on the support of local and national politicians and the commitment of politicians to continue to invest in the city and not just in the successful parts of the city.
I think Glasgow can no longer be considered to be a shrinking city. But that doesn't mean to say that Glasgow has now finally settled all its problems. The key to the future of all cities is their sustainability, and that requires that from time to time a city must reinvent itself. And this requires initiative, entrepreneurial skills, a capital base, and a close cooperation between developers, the communities, and the central city council.